Last week, the 89th Texas legislature got underway. Members of the House and Senate were sworn in. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick is again presiding over the Texas Senate, and a new House Speaker was elected, Dustin Burrows, a Republican from Lubbock. From now until June, state lawmakers in the House and Senate will work to tackle key issues like school vouchers, energy infrastructure, border security, and any number of things. I'm Ed Emmett, serving as host for today's episode of Baker Briefing. I'm a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute and also served 4 terms in the Texas House of Representatives many years ago. Today, I'm joined by Mark Jones, Baker Institute Fellow in Political Science, to discuss what we can expect over the next 140 days of this legislative session. Mark, thank you very much for being here.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
So let's dive in. At a very basic level, Mark, set the stage for listeners. What do we need to know about the Texas State Legislature? How does it operate? How often does it meet? What makes it unique in the U.S.?
Texas is one of only 4 states that holds biennial legislative session. It's the only large state that does so. Our legislature is in session for 140 days from mid-January through either late May or early June, this year through early June, which means that Texas tries to cram in effectively 2 years of legislation in a 140-day period. Now, if the legislature does not succeed in doing everything the governor wants, the governor is empowered to call the legislature back into special session, 30-day sessions, as many as he wants for as long as he wants, in order to try to get legislation passed. The House itself and the Senate itself cannot call themselves into special session except if it deals with impeachment. So really, from the legislative side, if they're going to get their agenda passed, they need to do it in the 140 days. The governor has the power, if he wants to, essentially call them back into special session if they fail to get his legislation passed. Last cycle in 2023, the House and Senate failed to agree on property tax relief. The governor had to call them back into special session, and they eventually resolved it. They also failed to pass his priority school choice legislation. He called them back multiple times. They still didn't support it. So that's one of the issues we'll be dealing with this session. For large states, the Texas legislature is very unique in that it meets only once every 2 years for 140 days in regular session. And its legislators are amateurs in the sense that they aren't really paid for their job. They only get $7,200 plus expenses, which also sets Texas apart from the larger states like California, New York, or Michigan, where for most legislators, their job, if not a full-time job, is at least their primary source of income. In Texas, every one of our members of the Texas House and Texas Senate has another source of income that's their primary source of income other than being a legislator. Although some do serve as de facto lobbyists, so I guess you could say they do earn a living as a legislator.
That's a good description, and it sets kind of the national standing of Texas and the legislature and why it's so different. Well, this year, as happens every 4 years, the legislature is kicking off the same month as a new presidential administration is taking office. And you described how Texas was unique, and we pride ourselves on being somewhat independent. What's going to be the impact of the national election results, if any, on what's going to be happening in Austin in the next 140 days?
I think there are a couple of things. One is Texas Republicans feel emboldened by their success statewide. Donald Trump won by 14 points. The average statewide Republican judicial candidate, which is sort of a generic Republican vote, won by 17 points. Republicans didn't lose any Texas House seats or Texas Senate seats or U.S. House seats, and they picked up 1 Senate seat and 2 Texas House seats. So from a Republican perspective, 2024 was a successful election year and wasn't a signal that they needed to put the brakes on conservative legislation the way, say, the wake-up call of 2018 was, where Ted Cruz almost lost to Beto O'Rourke, and people like Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, and Ken Paxton, the attorney general, came close to losing to their statewide Democratic rivals, and Republicans lost a dozen seats in the Texas House. So the dynamics are we have a Republican Party that's feeling emboldened as it moves into the session. We also are likely to see less legislation that is pushed back against a Biden administration. So in 2023 and 2021, we tended to see more legislation that was essentially signaling Republican opposition to a wide range of Democratic policies at the national level. That's not likely to be the case this time. And one area where the Texas legislature has spent on average between $2 and $3 billion each year over the past 4 years, border security and immigration, that's a budget line that's likely to perhaps drop a little bit. Won't disappear, but now that Donald Trump is in office, at least the pressure to continue spending so much of Texas taxpayer dollars on something that in theory should be the federal government's responsibility, there'll be a little less pressure for that. Now, I don't think we're going to see a dramatic cut in border security and immigration spending for political reasons, but I suspect it will be reduced at least somewhat to help pay for some other things.
You talked about Republicans a fair amount, and I think historically it's important for people to understand there were no Republicans in the Texas legislature prior to the 1960s, all the way back from Reconstruction to the 1960s. As a result, and even when I was there were 24 Republicans and 126 Democrats when I was first elected. And when I took off 79, by the time I left, it was all the way up to 40 Republicans and 110 Democrats. So the legislature really didn't operate on a partisan basis. But this year, the election of the Speaker of the House was particularly contentious among Republicans. What happened? Why was it contentious, and what's going to be the impact on the agenda going forward?
Well, so the Republicans adopted a caucus rule whereby the caucus agreed that if a candidate received 60% of the vote in the Republican caucus, they would be the formal caucus candidate. So the 88 Republicans met in December, at which point David Cook was receiving a large share of the Republican vote in the caucus. Initially not 60%, but then the faction that's aligned with Dustin Burrows, a more moderate center-right faction, left the proceedings and effectively allowed then Cook to be named the nominee from the Republican caucus. So Dustin Burrows is part of a group that's allied with Speaker Dade Phelan. He was, up until December, still continuing with his goal to be reelected for a third term as Speaker. If you recall, back in last March, the Lieutenant Governor, the Attorney General, both Republicans, as well as President Trump, weighed in trying to oust Dade Phelan in the Republican primary. They came close, but weren't able to do so. They lost that battle, but in one way they won the war in that they were able to get Phelan out as Speaker. But then again, you could also say they lost the war really because Phelan and his team simply replaced him with Dustin Burrows, who had a little less political baggage. And Burrows was very skillfully between December and January able to hold on to the support of a little more than 30 members of the Republican caucus. So not a majority, about a third, a little more than a third, closer to 2/5. And between the support he had among those Republicans, plus overwhelming support among Democrats, that led to him being elected Speaker during the second week of January, on January 14th. So now we have a Speaker who is essentially continuing the trend of our prior speakers. That is, if we think of the Texas legislature as having three parties, a more conservative Republican Party, a center-right conservative Republican Party, and Democrats, the center-right faction of the Republican Party has allied with most Democrats to maintain control of the House, something that really they've done since 2009 when Joe Strauss first started that mode by Republicans allying with Democrats to elect himself as Speaker. He retained that alliance throughout his tenure, gradually getting more and more Republican support. And Dade Phelan continued that, although he also enjoyed strong Republican support during his first terms. But now we have a situation where, sort of breaking with precedent, the Lieutenant Governor got very much involved in the House Speaker race, as did the Attorney General, and to a lesser extent the Governor, all favoring David Cook because he was the Republican caucus candidate. That didn't work out. And so now they're stuck with Dustin Burrows. I think the big question is how well will Burrows be able to get along with both the Lieutenant Governor, who runs the Senate agenda, and with the Governor, and how will that affect the policy process? And then related to that, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on Speaker Burrows to protect this mid-30s Republicans who supported him, but who will have to face the 2026 Republican primary. So Burrows will be pressed to deliver conservative legislation that those Republicans then can point to when they're being challenged in 2026, and most of them will be challenged based on the argument that they voted for Burrows and therefore they effectively voted against the Republican caucus candidate in favor of the person backed by Democrats.
I believe the state party, the state Republican Party, tried to put a rule in that said if you didn't vote correctly in the speaker race, you couldn't run as a Republican.
Yeah, there's nothing in Texas election law that gives the Texas Republican Party or any party the ability to decide who runs as a Republican or who runs as a Democrat.
Right. And I think what is interesting to those who have been in Texas a long time and followed the legislature, you described very accurately the three groups, the center-right Republicans, the more conservative far-right Republicans, and the Democrats. Well, it used to be the center-right Democrats, the farther left Democrats, and the Republicans. And if you go back to Speaker Billy Clayton and Pete Laney and people like that, they were Democrats, but they got elected with Republican votes, just like now the Republican gets elected with Democrat votes. So this didn't really change. So let's dig into the legislative agenda. What's going to be discussed? What policy changes might we expect? And of course, the big one is school vouchers. At least to Governor Abbott, that's the big one. He spent a lot of time and millions of dollars campaigning against those Republicans who voted against vouchers. What can we expect to see this year as a result, not only on vouchers, but on two or three other big issues?
The governor is virtually certain to name what he would call educational savings accounts or education savings account, ESAs, school choice, school vouchers, depending on your preference. That's going to be likely an emergency item, meaning that the legislature can effectively hold hearings and bring it to the floor prior to the 60-day mark, whereby for other legislation they can't. So if the governor doesn't name something as an emergency item and it doesn't have to deal with housekeeping regarding budget issues from the current budget year, or there's dramatic consensus, a 4/5 vote, which is pretty much impossible for anything that's somewhat controversial like school choice, it can't be debated. I think the governor is going to put it as an emergency item in his State of the State address, which should be in mid-February. And so we're likely to see that as one of the first mover items where the lieutenant governor will have that legislation out of the Senate in a matter of days. Maybe not in days, but in a week. The power and control the lieutenant governor has over the agenda in the Senate, as well as just the way the Senate operates procedurally, allows it to be very nimble and very quick. So I would expect the lieutenant governor to have his school choice legislation more or less ready to go, such that once the governor puts it as an emergency item, the Senate will get to work on it immediately, send it to the House, and then put the speaker in the position of figuring out what he's going to do with it. Because school choice legislation is going to put the speaker in a difficult position. On one hand, he needs to deliver school choice to help protect many of his Republican House members who voted for him and supported speakership because it's such an important issue for the governor. But he also doesn't want to alienate the Democrats whose support he needed to become speaker and technically needs to retain his speakership. And they pretty much adamantly, with a few exceptions, oppose school choice. How he threads that needle is going to be one of the difficult tasks that he has this session. I would assume he's already discussed this with many of the Democrats and informed them that he's going to need to pass some type of school choice legislation. But if he waters it down too much, whatever comes from the Senate, you may expect the Senate as well as the governor to reject it. And we could find ourselves going back to special sessions in the summer, because I don't think the governor is going to give up on this. He's put too much political capital, too much political time. I think at this point, he not only wants school choice legislation to pass, but he wants pretty much full-throated and expansive school choice to pass. It's going to be a little tougher. You may not get it entirely, but that's one issue. Property tax relief is another issue that's on the agenda. The legislature made some good progress in property tax relief back in 2023, but then you had counties like the Harris County government decide that they were going to use a hurricane loophole to ramp up everyone's property taxes by in the around the 12 to 15% range. And so that with appraisal creep has created further pressures on the legislature to deliver some type of additional property tax relief. That's an area where I can expect them to move in. Water infrastructure is a major issue. And then as we enter this cold snap, essentially dispatchable electric generation, primarily natural gas-fired plants, that'll be on the agenda as well, trying to find money to give more funding to the Texas Energy Fund.
You mentioned property taxes, and that leads us to dollars. The one piece of legislation that the legislature is obligated to pass every session is the appropriation bill to keep the state running. And of course, as you mentioned, it's a 2-year window. So they have to figure out what the state's going to need for the next 2 years. But Texas has been lucky in recent years, and again this year. State Comptroller Glenn Hager has announced the state has a surplus of $24 billion, giving them almost $200 billion. I think it's $194 billion that they will have to appropriate for the coming year. What do you think the priorities are going to be in that appropriations bill?
Well, about 5 or 6 billion of that has been set aside for teacher pay raises, public education infrastructure. So I would expect about a quarter of it's going to go to K through 12 public ed for salary increases, infrastructure, and other support. Another part of it's likely to go to property tax relief. That will be a source of it. And then the remainder for school choice legislation, you have to pay for that somehow. Some of it could go there. Some of it could go to water infrastructure, and some of it could go to power generation. One place I don't think it's going to go is, say, expanding Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Texas is one of 10 states that still has not expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. I would not expect them to do that this session.
Well, touching on another social issue that got a lot of attention during the last election, abortion policy. Texas was held up around the country as the tightest ban on abortion anywhere in the country, and it made it into national ads. And public polls show that we're generally like a little relaxation of that. Do you see any changes coming to Texas abortion policy?
No, back in 2021, Texas Republicans painted themselves into a corner. At the time, that's when they passed the trigger legislation that would be implemented only if Roe v. Wade fell. They didn't believe that Roe v. Wade was going to fall. And so they were caught by surprise by the Dobbs decision. When they passed that legislation, it was primarily symbolic for the more conservative base, and it was banned abortion unless the mother's life was at risk. And it didn't, for instance, provide a rape or incest exception. Most polls show that Texans really want to see a rape or incest exception. And if you look at the Democratic advertising, a lot of it really focused on that issue. In theory, that would be something that would be smart for Republicans to do, to essentially thwart some ads in the future. But politically, I just don't see them being able to go backwards on abortion. That is making abortion access greater rather than lower. I think probably most of the efforts by the more moderate to center-right wing of the Republican Party will be focused on pushing back against legislation that would make Texas abortion regulations even stricter, particularly cracking down on women receiving abortion drugs like mifepristone from outside of the state, providing support for women to travel outside of the state for abortion. So I think at the end of the day, we're likely to just see a maintenance of the status quo in terms of abortion legislation in Texas. It's not going to get stricter, but it's not going to get less strict.
You know, we've watched the nation become politically more polarized in recent years. I think it's safe to say we're beginning to see that in Texas, in large measure, I suppose, because most of the elections are decided in the primaries these days. With the gerrymandering the way it is, Republican districts are drawn, and Republican legislators know that they all have to just win the primary pretty much. There are only a handful of districts around the state that could go either way in the fall. What are your thoughts about the future of partisanship in Texas? And I know it's come up in relation to it's always been a tradition that the minority party got committee chairmanships in both the House and the Senate. Lieutenant Governor Patrick has even appointed Democrat chairs. And for example, even though there were only 40 Republicans, my final term in the House, I was chairman of the House Committee on Energy under a Democrat speaker. But that's been a big controversy in the speaker's race. What do you say about partisanship going forward?
I think for the time being, we're likely to see continued polarization. As you note, after the redistricting in 2021, only about 10 of our Texas House seats in the Texas House are effectively competitive. And even in a year, if we want to stretch that out a little bit, 12 to 13, meaning an overwhelming majority of both Democrats and Republicans really only need to worry about winning their primary. And we see purges primarily in the Republican Party, where the more centrist, center-right Republicans are essentially on the receiving end. But they aren't absent from the Democratic Party, as Sean Theory here in Houston found out when she essentially defied party line on transgender children and gender-affirming care for transgender children, and she lost her primary to Ashley Simmons. most of the movements on the Republican side, but it's also on the Democratic side as well, where Democratic moderates in the Texas House are having a tougher and tougher time. Richard Raymond was a good example of that. And then we also see that among Democrats at the national level in the U.S. House, people like Henry Cuellar and Vicente Gonzalez from South Texas are increasingly at odds with their party. So we definitely are seeing polarization. And the more and more important that the primary has, that just encourages people to move to the right and move to the left because that's where their political future is decided. So in the dispute on the House, traditionally, the Texas House has always provided the minority party with a roughly proportional, a little less than proportional share of the seats in terms of committee chair positions. That's something that Burrows is trying to have it essentially both ways. So that's a sore issue for Republicans, and particularly many of the 30 Republicans who supported him are wary of being on record of supporting Democratic chairs. And so the way that I believe the speaker is going to get around that is he's going to hold a vote that will be indirectly tied to whether Democrats can hold committee chairs or not, to allow a subset of the more than 30 Republicans who supported him to vote against Democratic chairs. I would assume, though, that the speaker has the 14 votes, at least 14 Republican votes he needs to be able to uphold that rule. So I would assume we're going to still have Democratic chairs. It's something that sets the Texas legislature apart from, say, the U.S. House, where the majority party controls every single committee chair. And it did exist in the Senate as well. The Senate actually traditionally was even more consensual in that it had a 2/3 rule whereby if you didn't have 2/3 of the senators agreeing on a piece of legislation, it couldn't come to the floor, which because of the partisan splits, especially during the 90s and 2000s, meant that if you didn't have at least some bipartisan support for a bill, it couldn't reach the floor. Now, Lieutenant Governor Patrick has largely done away with it. We still have it, but the threshold is now the 3/5 rule, which Republicans have that support.
We can spend a lot of time talking about the Texas legislature. It is a unique place, and I'll leave with one kind of unique thing about it, where they sit. In the Congress, for example, it's divided, and the Republicans sit together and the Democrat. In the Texas legislature, it's mixed, and who you sit next to may be of the other party. Those are all things that make it so interesting. And Mark, you're one of the premier experts on the legislature. I appreciate your taking the time to be with us today. Let's get together after the session and talk about what happened, and we'll see how close you were.
Yeah, it sounds good. And then, hopefully we won't have a lot of special sessions to talk about, but one never knows. That is a power the governor has, and he's not afraid to use it.
All right. Thank you, Mark, for being with us. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zimmel. Production support was provided by Rice University student intern Ira Matondong. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more, and thanks for listening.